My name is Adrian Scher, and I lead local giving for Google.org. This continues to be a strange but important time for our communities, our companies, and the work we're all doing as we continue to face COVID-19 and respond to the systemic inequities that both the pandemic and the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor laid bare. We all have a role to play in addressing the racial inequities in our country, which is why Google is pleased to be a supporter of NCG's corporate work through the 2021 Corporate Philanthropy Institute, and to be presenting our next speaker, Heather McGhee, who will be in conversation with NCG CEO, Dwayne Marsh. Heather has been a leader in promoting solutions to inequality in this nation. She's an author, a commentator, a researcher, and a leader who led and grew DMOS as a major force in advancing an inclusive multicultural democracy. In other words, she's a rock star. Her most recent book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, examines how racism impacts our country from democracy to the economy and public infrastructure. She tells the story of how public goods in this country, from parks and pools to functioning schools, have become private luxuries, and how we've stagnated wages, left workers behind, allowed inequality to increase, and have yet to have healthcare that truly benefits all. But she also champions what can be accomplished when we do come together. Now, without further ado, a fireside chat with Heather McGhee and Dwayne Marsh.
I've been a fan of yours for years. When I was doing training work with more than 300 jurisdictions or across the country, confronting the challenges of racial inequity, we'd often share a clip from C-SPAN, where your thoughtful response to a white caller conflicted about his notions of race demonstrated how to bridge a seemingly intractable divide. The exchange was transformative for thousands of public sector workers, which just goes to show you, you never know the full impact your work is having. Welcome.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thanks so much.
You know, you've had an inspiring career as a movement building leader, federal policy advocate, national thought leader, and champion for racial justice. You were compelled to take the time and make the commitment it took to write this extraordinary book. What drove you to take that step?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you all for having me and for being a part of and staying in this important conversation, and more importantly, for committing to action. Because as I learned throughout the research and writing that it took to take the sum of us, we really all rise or fall together. And ultimately, we are only as strong as our most vulnerable members of our community. And so, why a book, right? I mean, in some ways, I had my dream job. I was running a think tank addressing, what to me seemed to be the most salient and important issues of our time, policies impacting inequality in our economy and our democracy. And yet, it felt like the tools that I had as a policy advocate, research, statistical analysis, data, the inclination and the sort of mission to use that research to craft evidence-based policy solutions and try to get them in the hands of powerful people, whether in business or in government, and hope that they would make better policy decisions. That sort of tool set wasn't really sufficient ultimately, because it kept seeming like we knew what we needed to do. We knew what the big problems were in our economy around poverty, wages, a lack of healthcare, lack of childcare, paid family leave, and yet it just wasn't happening. And so I decided to take a journey. It was really a series of trips over 3 years across the country, from California to Mississippi to Maine and back again multiple times, really talking to a different set of people, sort of outside of the Beltway and the sort of Acela corridor, talking to ordinary folks, organizers, faith-based leaders, about their America and about the deeper stories that we tell one another, and how it is that ultimately racism in our politics and our policymaking is so pervasive. Of course it is, right? I mean, we had a society that was explicitly structured around ensuring a racial color line for the vast majority of our history. And so racism remains so endemic to our politics and our policymaking, and often in ways that are quite subterranean, that ultimately nobody is unscathed, and that it's a common denominator of so many of our most vexing public problems.
I challenge anyone to read the first 30 pages of the manuscript and then put the book down. We were talking before, I was saying, oh, I haven't read a book cover to cover in so long. It really is a compelling read. Who are you hoping to reach with the message?
Well, Dwayne, that is high praise to a writer. I have to say, thank you so much. I really, I wanted to reach not only sort of a different audience than I had heretofore had access to, kind of elite decision makers, but I also wanted to grab people in a different way, and that's why I chose a book and chose story and chose to try to hold myself to a standard of trying to make it, sort of a page turner about racism. And I want the folks who read this book to be people who've maybe never picked up a book on race or racism, who don't usually read nonfiction books, who certainly may not ever read books about the economy. People who just want a good story, who are compelled by a good story, and who are trying to figure out what's wrong with us, why we're so divided and dysfunctional. Why, as I say at the opening of the book, why it seems like we can't have nice things. And by nice things, I really do mean the kinds of things that a high-functioning, wealthy, representative democracy should be able to ensure for itself.
There's so many powerful aspects of this, but one I'm hoping you can reflect on for a moment is just this notion of the age of inequality. What's at stake if we can't reverse our trajectory in this era that you so aptly coined?
So this question of what are the costs of inequality, not just to people who are struggling to make ends meet, as if that weren't enough of a reason to want to take action, but also to our overall economic growth, is one that I think is really central for us to really understand. Last summer, Citigroup put out a report where they calculated conservative estimates that the black-white economic gaps in education, income, small business, investment, wealth, had cost the overall U.S. GDP $16 trillion over the last 20 years. The McKinsey Group put out a report a couple of years ago that the racial wealth divide, costs $1 to $1.5 trillion a year of our overall economy, right? And we have this racial wealth divide because of public policy, because, as I write about in the book, the public policies that helped create intergenerational wealth, that helped subsidize it and make it possible for working class people, the children of often European immigrants, to have a no or low down payment mortgage to be able to sort of build that nest egg and that American dream, the massive subsidization of housing development, and the regulation and subsidy and backstopping that enabled the mortgage market. All of those explicitly excluded Black families. And so today we have an average Black wealth of 15 cents for every dollar held by the average white household. And this is not about income or education. This is where it's really important for us to really confront the myths and stereotypes, because a Black college graduate has less average household wealth than a white high school dropout. Let me say that again. A Black college graduate will on average have less household wealth. I'm talking about home equity, savings, retirement, stocks and bonds, than a high school dropout who is white. So that's when you know that it's really about history showing up in your wallet, that wealth, which is so important to real financial security, to being able to withstand the blows of job loss or a pandemic, to be able to invest in a new business or pay for your children's education. That's what wealth does. And that's really where today you see families of color really paying interest on racist decisions made often long before we were born, explicitly racist decisions. And so we've got to address that racial wealth divide. And when we look at it not just from a sort of zero-sum framework, the idea that, white families were able to have this sort of leg up for most of the 20th century, and now it's time to ensure that Black neighborhoods, Black communities, and families have that same investment. I don't see it as this is going to cost white families and benefit Black families. I see it as our entire economy is not doing as well as it should be, is held back. And so I see those kinds of investments to repair what was the harm that has been done, and that continues to aggregate, really as seed capital for the America that we're becoming, because we've simply got to unlock the potential of all of our children and families in this country. And as we become a nation with no racial majority, it's going to matter more and more that the average, black and brown child have the same kind of opportunities that our white brothers and sisters do.
Narrative is such an important and recurrent theme that you've identified, not just in the book, but in your career, working to advance racial and economic equity. Why is it so important to win the battle for narrative of where this nation is heading?
Let me just first define what I mean by narrative, because I think it's a word that gets tossed around a lot, and so people may just be holding different ideas. Narrative is really about the deeper story, the belief, the common sense about what's right and what's wrong, a sort of a framework into which lots of arguments and policies and issues get poured in and then filtered through, right? So if we have a deep narrative that is a belief in a hierarchy of human value that was created in order to justify the original economic model in our society of stolen land, stolen people, and stolen labor. This idea that some groups of people are better than others, and therefore this kind of brutal exploitation was not only defensible, but sort of proper and the natural order of things, even the divinely ordained order of things. That deep narrative that was necessary to make segregation make sense, right? To make policies like, of course, lenders should not receive any federal guarantee or backstop or mortgage insurance if they lent in Black neighborhoods, right? That was a common sense practice and policy because it was embedded in a deeper narrative about the riskiness of Black families, of the sort of inability of Black people to operate in the formal economy. Sort of Black folks are allergic to money, so that means it's okay that we keep denying them, ways to have it, right? That sort of deep belief. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about narrative. And so when we fight or debate on the realm of policy idea, what should the minimum wage be? Should we have truly universal health care? Should there be a work requirement for Medicaid? Things like that. Ultimately, what you're doing is tapping into that core narrative. And so narrative creates the permissive structure for what gets a head nod, and yeah, of course we should do that, and what seems to be unacceptable or too much of a cost or going against the sort of natural order of things. And so when you are trying with your philanthropic dollars, with your activism in your community to ensure more peace, security, and prosperity for more people, you do at one level have to engage with the core narrative and recognize that in our society, there are different groups that have different narratives. And so if you don't know what the deep narratives about your community are that are held by the decision makers, then you're missing a piece of the strategic puzzle. And so that's what I mean by we've got to do the narrative work. We've got to understand what are the deep stories that are held by decision makers that make it easy or harder for us to make progress in certain areas.
As you were saying that, I was struck by the image of the kind of quiet negotiation that happens at policy tables that is shaped by that. Like we think of the vitriolic conversations and the people at opposite polar ends. But what you're pointing at is if the narrative is being carried in a certain way, those quiet decisions can have just as profound impact. So appreciate that reflection. The book's 289 pages and then almost as many pages of notes. You clearly did your homework. And so I want to talk a little bit about what you learned and the analysis behind that. Anyone who's read it or knows their segregation history is haunted by the death of the public pool in the United States. You tell the story well. Can you just share a bit about why this was so emblematic for you of the crisis we face as a collective nation?
Yeah, the central metaphor in the sum of us is the drained pool, and it's the story of what happened to many of the nearly 2,000 lavishly funded public swimming pools that used to grace the American landscape. These pools were part of a building boom in public goods, public amenities like libraries and roads and bridges and parks and schools that were part of a deeper government ethos, a sort of social ethos that said, coming out of the lessons of the excesses of the first Gilded Age and the crucible of the Great Depression, said, you know what? It is in fact government's responsibility and duty to ensure a decent standard of living for its people. And we have to, the deep narrative at that time, right? The deep story was this is fitting and proper for the government to make sure that there were public goods. And these public goods included things that are arguably more economically significant than swimming pools, things like Social Security, like the massive investment in housing that I mentioned, the creation of the ability through mortgages to have, working class people own homes and create an appreciating asset. The public good of labor regulation, of the idea of minimum wages and maximum hour laws, of health and safety, of collective bargaining. Those were public goods. Even the antitrust and anti-business concentration and monopoly laws were seen as public goods, that there was a public interest in ensuring the proper balance to have safe, flourishing markets for small businesses and new entrants. These are all the kinds of public goods that I'm talking about. And virtually everything I just described was racially segregated and for whites only in one way or another, rather whether it was explicitly like the redlining and segregation and the racial covenants that the government required in the housing subsidies, or it was things like the GI Bill, which was race neutral on its face, but where the benefits filtered in through often racially exclusionary housing and education sectors, or the Social Security Act, which carved out in a concession to the Southern Congressional Caucus the two sectors of the economy that most Black workers worked in: agriculture and domestic work. So this sort of public goods spirit, but with an asterisk, a whites-only public goods, really did help create the greatest middle class the world had ever seen, right? The U.S. had the highest standard of living in the world in the 1950s. And yet when the civil rights movement began to empower Black families to say, you know what? We've been paying taxes all along. Those are our funds that are helping to build those public goods. And in the case of swimming pools, we want our kids to swim too. And when courts began to decide with Black families to integrate public goods, many towns and cities across the country, and not just in the South, drained their public swimming pools rather than integrate them. It is a story that was replicated in so many places across the country of a town, city, county elite deciding that instead of sharing a public good, they would destroy it. They would change what was once a public good into a private cost or amenity. They would privatize them, sell the pools to the YMCA. They would create new membership-only swim clubs. Middle-class white families began to build individual pools in their backyards. And really, it's a story of losing out on the commons. It's a story of what was once a public good becoming a private cost. And it's a metaphor that helps explain how we went from being the society that had really discovered the formula, Dwayne, for creating broadly shared middle-class prosperity, and really walked away from that formula in the post-civil rights years, when it became clear that for the first time, the government, which had been the enforcer of the racial hierarchy, would now be the upender of the racial hierarchy. And that was a real betrayal of the sort of very character of government in the white popular imagination. And you began to see a real turning away from trust of government, a real turning towards the market, and a sense that government could do no right, and that it was better to have, unfettered tax cuts and deregulation. And, I think there's some argument for a balance, but the 50 years of rising inequality that we've seen and the hollowing out of the middle class, white, black, and brown, has really shown us that just like with the drained public pools, we lost something when we turned away from public goods. That in fact, racism in our politics and our policymaking ultimately has a cost for everyone.
You know, part of why we're having this conversation is I experienced that in my own family history in Virginia, where the last of the schools to segregate were litigated for decades after Brown versus Board, and inspired my family to be engaged in me as well. So some dividends perhaps paying out of a hugely inequitable system, but I think it's part of what has inspired many of us to do this work. One uplifting aspect that your exploration revealed was this concept of the solidarity dividend. How might that pave the way forward to heal a divided nation?
So this thankfully was something that I really began to see in my journey that gave me hope. I'll admit that I started out the journey to write the Song was from a very frustrated place, where I was despairing of our ability to do the basic things that a high functioning society should, where I was feeling like we really needed to, there were so many fronts on which we were fighting to just do, what we should do as a society. And I saw the zero sum lie, the idea that progress for people of color has to come at white folks' expense. That was very much a phenomenon that I saw all over the country as I dug into these various different issues, where it was housing or education or workers' rights or climate change and the environment. Excuse me. But I also was able to see that, in fact, all over the country, people are coming together across lines of race. They are linking up arms and understanding that the most important things in life we simply can't achieve on our own, right? I can recycle all I want. I can't stop global climate change on my own. I can get a tutor for my son. I can't fund his neighborhood school on my own, right? I can't do these things that really matter, that really help create a society worth living in on my own. And in a multiracial society like we have, it's going to require cross-racial collaboration. And so that's where I began to see this phenomenon of the solidarity dividend. And that's the idea of people coming together across lines of race to achieve things together that we simply can't on our own. And it creates a multiplier effect of power, of potential. And solidarity dividends that I saw were things like cleaner air and higher wages and better funded schools. And they were happening because people were able to put aside cultural and neighborhood differences. People were able to really meet, not in a way that ignored race, but was very conscious of race, and more importantly, was conscious of the ways in which the people who were benefiting from division, whether it was the polluters or politicians who wanted to, keep draining the pool of public resources, they were benefiting from division. And so the people who really needed something from one another and really needed something better for their community needed to get together and overcome those divisions for the benefit of all.
I want to invite folks to share their questions, and know that we're going to have a Q&A before we close out. I could ask questions all day, but I know I'll get in trouble if I do. But while those are coming in, I do want to ask a bit about the corporate imperative. This is our Corporate Philanthropy Institute. We frequently think about the roles that government and philanthropy have to play in addressing systemic inequity, but what is the corporate imperative? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the sector, not just as an economic player, but how it influences attitudes and perspectives.
Yeah, well, it's really important, right? I mean, I think that as we've seen in the past year, corporations are now being expected to live out values that are consonant with their consumers, their workers, and their investors. And I think that's right. I think we can't have a society where so much power and influence is held in a corporate sector that is not held to account and is not seen as part of the civic infrastructure of our society, part of the gatekeepers and those who set norms and say that things like January 6th are not acceptable. Things like voter suppression and cheating and lying are not acceptable. Things like, violence are not acceptable. So that is certainly, I think, a natural part of where we are in society, given how powerful corporations have become. Um, and, my provocation would be that I'm on the board of two foundations. I've spent my entire career in the independent sector, so I appreciate the potential, the enormous potential of philanthropy. But that is engulfed by the what the public can do. So, philanthropy can help to address hunger, but it took the past year of public policy to bring poverty down to the lowest rate that it's been on record, which is where we are right now. And I think every public conversation should include that fact. We should know that poverty has been a policy choice all along, and that different choices around the way we do unemployment benefits to make gig workers eligible, the way we change the eligibility and levels for food stamps, things like the child tax credit being refundable and better optimized. These all have helped push child poverty down by 84%, right? So this is just extraordinary. That's what government can do. That's what our collective resources can do. And so my provocation, excuse me, to those in corporate philanthropy is not just to think about what you can do with your, end of year, dollars and what you can do with your community supports, which is super important, but ultimately what you can do with your voice. Because for better or worse, corporations have an outsized role in the power structure that sets our public rules. So whether that is recognizing that the Chamber of Commerce is right now opposed to the idea of building back better, of a massive investment in what I think of as simply refilling the pool of public goods, of making sure that, working and middle class families can afford to go to work because they know that they have childcare that's affordable and elder care that's affordable. A huge investment in infrastructure. Ultimately, that is a real bargain, right? We talk about it as $3.5 trillion. A, that's over 10 years. B, 2/3 of it is paid for by tax increases, and the rest also includes a whole bunch of tax cuts for working and middle class family that will be a real stimulus to the economy. And, think about the cost of not taking that action on climate and on care and on human infrastructure. And so, human and hard infrastructure. And so the question is the corporate sector as represented by the chamber and the business roundtable that is opposing all of that because of possible corporate tax increases, is that what we want, right? Is that what you want as and is that decision going to actually do more to harm than any of the philanthropic support you can give in your community? And so really understanding the different levels on which, there's the statement, there's the philanthropic support, and ultimately there is the way in which corporate actors can decide to have the corporate sector be represented differently and speak to more inclusive values, not just in the boardroom, not just in the statements in the philanthropy, but also in society writ large.
And yeah, I know you led a process at Demos to really center racial equity in your strategies of decision making. Any lessons in that, or in what you've seen that has been working to move corporations to take some of these steps that you lift up? How do we get the conversation going to change the trajectory of how ethos may be within an institution?
Dwayne, it's a really interesting question. So I was the leader of the organization for 4 years, and when I started, it was 75% white. I was the only person of color on the executive team of this think tank, and so I launched a process that ended up, transforming it into a majority person of color organization. We doubled our budget. We really became more strategic and more impactful on all of our goals. But I do think, it was a small nonprofit, relatively speaking. But I do think that what we learned, sort of the core approaches, are quite relevant for the corporate sector. And about halfway through the process, I was called by the CEO of Starbucks, Howard Schultz, at the time, after the incident in Philadelphia where two black men were unjustly arrested in the store, and really got through that process of totally on a pro bono basis, just sort of seeing up close what they were trying to do to repair and to create a curriculum for their 250,000 or so frontline employees. And Sherilyn Ifill, the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and I co-authored a report of recommendations for Starbucks. Now, this was not something Starbucks wanted. They did not want a public report. They just wanted us to come along on the ride and give advice, and and yet I felt like they were doing something courageous, and that also the entire corporate sector was, for a moment, looking at what they had done, and they wanted to know what more could be done. And so if folks go to demos.org/Starbucks, they can find the report that we issued, which is really for a corporate audience. What does it look like to really center racial equity in corporate practices? I also should lift up even more recently, Color of Change, where I'm the chair of the board, has done just extraordinary work to create an initiative called Beyond the Statement, which sets out a set of principles for a number of sectors. Tech is one of them. Hollywood is one. Fashion is one. I think there are a couple of more coming online soon, that really says, well, how do you go beyond your Black Lives Matter statement? How do you go beyond your George Floyd statement? And what does it look like to really center racial equity? And so if folks Google Color of Change Beyond the Statement, they can find that work.
So we're gathered here as representatives of organizations, but first and foremost, we're people whose fates are inextricably linked to that of this nation. What can I do? What can we do as people to turn the tide on some of the harmful forces that have brought us to this moment?
Yeah. It's an important question. And I think ultimately, there has been a real outpouring of hunger among individuals to do something, to get educated about a history that we've basically been robbed of. And I don't just mean white folks. I mean, I think all of us have been woefully miseducated about our very recent history. And so there's been a real rush towards that kind of learning. And I think that's wonderful, because if you don't know your history, if you don't know how we got here, then we really remain vulnerable to manipulation and the forces of division. And so I think that, the sort of individual education that seems to be happening so much right now, and that is really a crucial first step, is important. That said, I don't think it's enough. And, in the sort of probably spectrum of anti-racist authors, I'm probably pretty far on it's not about just what you know and unlearn and read and consume. It's really about what you do in collective action. It's really not the task at hand is not an individual one, right? The task at hand is one where collaboration and organizing, excuse my allergies right now, where collaboration and organizing really creates a multiplier effect. And so, what can individuals do? First, learn, right? First, get a sense of the real sort of racial history of your community, of the place where you live, of the country in which you live. I'm not an historian. I'm not. And yet I did feel like I needed to include a fair amount of history in each of the chapters just so we understood how we got to this place. Okay, we can't understand our contemporary economy and society without understanding what brought us here. But then, and this is where it gets fun, then you really do need to put the books down and join in fellowship. And there are so many local and community organizations. You can start one. So often they start as sort of a book club and then they start to realize, well, you know what, let's take action. And let's find out, what's going on with school funding in our neighborhood, what's going on with toxic pollution in communities of color and low wealth communities, what's going on with affordable housing in our community, and how can we get involved, and what's going on with attacks on honest education in our local school district. We're reading about Tennessee and 11 other states where a really well-funded and coordinated movement has helped to put conversations like these on the defensive in local school districts where laws have been passed to ban history and to ban the teaching of history that might make white students feel uncomfortable. This is really what has happened in 12 states. And it's that, whether or not it passes at the state level in California, or, I guarantee that there are people who want to see it happen in local school districts and are creating a culture of fear among educators about what they're teaching in school, for a multiracial generation of children who need to know the truth, who need to not be robbed of our shared history as our generation was. And so, get involved in your local school district and make sure that folks know there that you expect, honest education that is race conscious and that is not cowed by right wing organizing. So there's so many different ways to take action as an individual, but in fellowship with others.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience wondering, how do we advance issues of race, democracy, equity, and justice when the divide is so great and even what is true has become politicized?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really the question that you ask. I think that ultimately I'm reminded that even though it seems like the excesses are so strong right now and the divide is so deep and the incentives from our most powerful actors are often to divide us even further, right? Whether we're talking about the algorithms of the platforms on which all of human experience is now lived, or we're talking about politicians who really see their core strategy as dividing and creating resentment and a sort of cycle of anger and outrage. But I think about how our ancestors had to face so much more. It really was worse. And they had so much less to face it down with. And yet here we stand. And so I think part of the viewer's question was both what are the practical steps, which I'm speaking to, but also like how is it even possible, right? How could we possibly, right? Is it not worthy of despair? So I would say no, it is not worthy of despair. No, we must keep hope, and we must remember ultimately that we've got to both choke off the supply of racist hate and zero-sum lies in our society. And so that means really holding those powerful actors in the media, in social media, in politics accountable for the division and building enough power to be able to do that. We are certainly at a moment of a real inflection point around the social media piece of that. Um, and then from the bottom up, we've got to create good old fashioned organizing that ultimately gets us in right relationship with our neighbors, that is difficult, right? It's much more comfortable to be simply around the people that agree with you. But that if we don't do this bridging, and if we don't listen to the fundamental human emotions and needs that are behind all of this vitriol, then we're not doing the work. And so I think that is a really important piece of it as well. Oh, Dwayne, you're muted.
Even in this young century, we're already facing multiple inflection points, right? The foreclosure crisis of 2008, the 2016 election cycle, the racial reckoning in 2020. Is there something in our views on race as a nation that is dooming us to relive these cycles? And what would you want to unlock if you could just, start to rewrite that narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the zero sum view that we are locked in a competition for well-being, that there's sort of a fixed pie of well-being, and if one group gets a bigger slice and the other group must get a smaller slice, this lie of human hierarchy, this sense that there's sort of a ladder, if you will, of status and belonging, and so people near the top must sort of jealously guard their position. That zero-sum lie, I think, is what keeps us from just doing what a healthy community would do, which is have moments of pain or suffering or injustice and have a full community response that says, of course, let's fix that. Of course, we believe you, and let us heal, let us do what is necessary to get you right and keep moving forward together, right? Instead, we have, the financial crisis where instead of really listening to the mostly black and brown communities that a decade before the financial crisis were the canaries in the coal mine around subprime lending. As I talk about in the chapter on the financial crisis, if people in power had listened to black homeowners who had good credit, who were existing homeowners, and who marketed these predatory refinance loans, if they had listened back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, we simply would not have had the financial meltdown that we had in 2008. And so, in some core way, there was this zero sum logic that saw enormous profits on one side of the ledger and therefore was able to really discount the pain that generated it, and that used the logic of the racial stereotype, the very old one, the same one that substantiated redlining, right? The idea that black people are sort of inherently risky, that blinded policymakers, lenders, boards of directors to what was actually going on. So that's where I think this sort of zero-sum racial hierarchy remains an impediment to the sort of proper functioning of our diverse society. And if I could do one thing, if I could snatch away one thing from our society, it would definitely be that.
I'm going to remind folks to put their questions in if they want to get them. We have just a few minutes left. I just want to note, though, as you were telling that story, it took me to the book and the straight line you drew from practices that were the origins of some corporations' wealth in slavery to the same kinds of practices by investment companies that led to the foreclosure. So the through line of this approach of how our system has really kind of racialized and penalized certain populations has huge cost. So I just appreciated that. You also mentioned in the book that this nation as a wounded society, hasn't actually had true truth and reconciliation. I
Yeah.
just want to give you a moment to reflect on that
Yeah.
before I close with a couple of questions.
Yeah, I really don't think that we can continue to do it on our own, right? Other societies that have not had nearly the depth of the racial wounds that we have had processes to get on the same page, right? To create a real sense of truth about what happened, about the enormity of the crimes against humanity. Um, and we have not had anything like that. We've never had a formal apology for slavery. We've never had a formal apology for the genocide of indigenous peoples. And I mean, we've never had a process that would create a sense of being on the same page and of shared commitment to a different way. And so in at the end of the book, I talk about a framework that is operational right now in a few dozen community based efforts called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And it's something that my mother actually designed when she was at the Kellogg Foundation. And that gives communities a real ground up way to create a coalition of stakeholders who create a community history that centers race, that is really about rewriting the narrative of the community's history on racial issues, that sets out a community vision that says, what would a Dallas or a Topeka or a San Jose look like if it were finally free of this lie of human hierarchy? And then sets out to make changes in a number of core areas. It's something that I really do want to invite the audience to look into further as people want sort of a real practical, tangible thing that they can do in their community. It is often supported by community foundations and by local sort of corporate partners. You can find the whole framework on healourcommunities.org, which is the Kellogg website that was set up around it. This is not something that I'm selling by any means or that my mother gets a cut of or anything like that. But it's a framework that was really developed, with the partnership of over 140 experts in these kinds of things. And that is helping communities in the absence of national leadership. There's a House and a Senate bill to have a national truth, racial healing, and transformation. It's helping communities really have a framework for getting on the same page. And it's deeply inclusive, right? It's not just about black, white. It's about every community that's represented in the area. And it's really about experiencing the desired state of connecting to shared humanity and shared purpose. It's not about us versus them. It really is about the whole and the collective, and about healing, which is what really sets it apart.
As you were talking, I was thinking about how often we think about wealth being passed by generations as primarily a phenomenon in white communities, but clearly your mom has passed something special on to you in the work that you do as well. So it's nice to know that we can see that transference of wealth as well. I want to invite you to share briefly one of your favorite visits. I was struck by what happened in Lewiston, Maine, what happened in North Richmond in our own community, but just a few minutes on what was powerful for you and gave you hope as you tried to see how we can move out of this situation we're in today.
Absolutely. Well, I'll do two very briefly. One is Lewiston, Maine. It's a dying mill town, as they're referred to, deindustrialized in Maine, the whitest state in the nation. It's a place where the Main Street had a lot of vacant and boarded up shops. But it's a town that has really been revitalized in terms of the economy and in terms of the civic culture by new Mainers. And these new Mainers are mostly African, Muslim refugees and immigrants in, again, the whitest state in the nation. And I visited there a number of times and talked to the town administrator, this guy named Phil, who just couldn't say enough about how important it was to have new people and how much of a benefit they were to the community. Talked to a woman named Cecile who ended up going to the Franco Cultural Center because she was Franco-Canadian, which was sort of the previously largest ethnic group in Lewiston, Maine. and found that everybody there at the Franco Cultural Center had really kind of traded away the language of their childhood, and they didn't really have a culture, even at the cultural center, of speaking French. And she was very isolated and lonely and wanted to reconnect with her childhood in that way. And so she went over to the affordable housing complex and found that the people who spoke the best French in the city were African Francophone folks from places like the Congo, who were really able to come and begin to teach French to the elderly white Mainers in a way that really created these community bonds. And I talk about those bonds, as well as some of the community organizing that was done across race to win things like Medicaid expansion and elder care in the state as solidarity dividends. And I also remember very vividly a conversation that I had with a woman named Bridget in Kansas City, who was a white Irish American fast food worker who, when the fight for 15 in a union came to her town, was really cynical about it. She said, there's no way they're going to pay people like me $15 an hour. She also, when the fight for 15 came to her town, was very anti-immigrant and really sort of believed a lot of anti-Black stereotypes. But she went to the first organizing meeting anyway. And when she did, she heard a Latina woman stand up and tell her own story about having 3 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment with bad plumbing and feeling trapped and like there was no way for her to ever get ahead. And as Bridget told me, I saw myself in her. And she decided that she would join the movement and she would begin organizing. And now she says, it's not about us versus them. For us to come up, they've got to come up too, because as long as we're divided, we're conquered. And she told me, when I spoke to her after the Trump election, she said, this movement, the movement of Fight for 15, the movement of low-paid workers, is really trying to teach white workers that racism is bad for them too, because it keeps us, as she said, divided from our brown and Black brothers and sisters. So that will always stick with me.
Excellent. I just want to share something very quickly as we go into closing. It may sound familiar to you. This is our destiny. To make it manifest, we must challenge ourselves to live our lives in solidarity across color, origin, and class. We must demand changes to the rules in order to disrupt the very notion that those who have more money are worth more in our democracy and our economy. Since this country's founding, we have not allowed our diversity to be our superpower, and the result is the United States is not more than the sum of its disparate parts. Heather, thank you for an incredible conversation.
Oh, thank you, Dwayne, and thank you for all that you do. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it.